The creek ran cold and clear through Bridger's Hollow, Montana territory in the spring of 1879, and it was there that Elijah Moss first saw what would consume the next 3 years of his life. He stood on the eastern bank, his wife Adelaide beside him, both of them studying the water with the focused intensity that marked all their shared endeavors. They had ridden out from town that morning, their horses picking careful paths through the snow-melt mud to survey the 40 acres they had purchased for $60 from a land agent who seemed far too eager to be rid of it. The property was considered marginal at best, a narrow valley flanked by steep timbered ridges, bisected by a creek that ran enthusiastic in spring and reduced to a trickle by August. No one wanted land that couldn't support cattle through the dry season. But Elijah and Adelaide Moss were not looking at what the land was. They were looking at what it could become. Adelaide knelt by the water's edge, her split riding skirt dark with mud, and placed her hand flat against the current. The water was perhaps 8 inches deep here, moving with purpose over a bed of smooth river stone. She held her position for a long moment, feeling the pressure, estimating the volume. "Elijah," she said, her voice carrying that particular quality it took on when she was calculating, "this creek drops maybe 60 feet between the upper meadow and where it leaves our property." Her husband, a lean man of 32 with the calloused hands of someone who had worked every job the frontier offered, nodded slowly. He was already seeing it, the same vision that had formed in Adelaide's mind. 60 feet over half a mile, he said. "That's gradient enough." "Enough for what?" she asked, though she already knew. He met her eyes, and in them was the shared understanding that had made them partners in every sense, enough to make it run year-round, enough to turn this into something. The idea was not entirely original. Elijah had worked for 2 seasons on a placer mining operation in California, where hydraulic systems had been used to move massive volumes of water. Adelaide, who had been raised on a failing farm in Illinois, had watched her father lose 3 consecutive crops to drought while a river ran fat and indifferent 2 miles distant. Both of them understood that water, properly controlled and directed, was worth more than gold in this country. What they envisioned was a system of check dams and diversion channels that would capture the spring runoff, store it in a series of small reservoirs carved into the hillside, and then release it in measured amounts throughout the summer, keeping the creek alive and the valley green when every other ranch in the territory was watching their grass turn to straw. It was engineering on a scale that seemed absurd for a couple with no formal education, no crew, and no capital beyond what they could earn with their own labor. It was also, as the town of Bridger's Hollow would soon make abundantly clear, the most ridiculous waste of effort anyone had ever contemplated. They made their first mistake 3 days later, when they rode into town to purchase supplies and made the error of explaining their intentions. The mercantile was run by a man named Josiah Kern, a thick-bodied former freighter who prided himself on practical wisdom. He listened to Elijah's careful description of check dams and gradient calculations with an expression of increasing disbelief. "You want to dig ditches," Kern said slowly, "to move water that's already moving." Elijah, patient as always, tried again. "The water moves, but it doesn't stay. We're going to make it stay. Make it available through the dry season." Kern looked at Adelaide, as if expecting her to talk sense into her husband, but she simply stood beside Elijah, her expression calm and resolute. Kern shook his head. "Son, water goes where it wants. That's the nature of water. You can't make it do otherwise." Adelaide spoke for the first time, her voice polite but firm. "Water goes downhill, Mr. Kern. That's all it does. If you give it a path, it'll follow. You're just choosing the path." Kern's face darkened. He didn't care for being corrected, particularly not by a woman. You two are going to spend years moving dirt around to accomplish what? A creek that runs in summer? You know what else does that? A creek that runs in summer. Just buy land with a better creek. But there wasn't land with a better creek, not at a price they could afford, and even if there was, that wasn't the point. The point was that the land could be made better, that human effort and intelligence could transform the marginal into the productive. That was the whole promise of the frontier, though apparently that promise had limits that Josiah Kern found reasonable, and limits he found insane, and the Mosses' plan fell decisively into the latter category. By evening, the story had spread. At the saloon, at the boarding house, at the Sunday service, the tale was told and retold, each iteration adding new layers of absurdity. The couple who thought they could rebuild a creek, the fools who were going to dig their way to prosperity, the idiots who didn't understand that you worked with the land as it was, not as you wished it to be. Martin Schaefer, who ran 2,000 head of cattle on the largest ranch in the territory, made it a point to ride out to their property the following week. He sat his big sorrel gelding at the edge of their land and watched as Elijah and Adelaide worked with a surveyor's transit, a battered instrument Elijah had purchased third-hand from a bankrupt railroad crew. They were mapping elevations, driving stakes, running string lines. Schaefer watched for 20 minutes before he called out, "You two planning to move that whole mountain while you're at it?" Elijah straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "No, sir, just the water." Schaefer walked his horse closer. "I've been ranching this country for 15 years. You know what I've learned? The land tells you what it can do. You don't tell it. This valley is dry season marginal. Always has been, always will be. You'd be better off selling to me and buying something sensible." Adelaide, who had been kneeling by one of the stakes, stood and faced him. "What's sensible, Mr. Schaefer?" His smile was condescending. "Accepting reality, working within your limitations, not wasting 3 years of your life on a project that can't work." "Can't," she asked, "or hasn't? Those are different things." Schaefer's smile faded. He was not accustomed to being challenged, and certainly not by a woman in mud-caked boots holding a ball of surveyor's twine. "You'll see," he said, and rode off. They would hear variations of that phrase for the next 3 years. "You'll see." The work began in earnest in June of 1879, and it was labor of a kind that broke men who were not already broken in and remade by the frontier. They started at the upper end of their property, where the creek emerged from a narrow granite canyon. Here, Adelaide had identified a natural pinch point, a place where the canyon walls came within 30 feet of each other. This would be the site of their first check dam. The design was Adelaide's, though the labor was shared equally. She had spent weeks sketching and calculating, using principles she had taught herself from a water engineer's manual Elijah had found in a Denver bookshop. The dam would be a hybrid structure, a stone core faced with timber, 8 feet high and angled slightly upstream to distribute the water's force. Behind it, they would excavate a reservoir capable of holding approximately 200,000 gallons. From this reservoir, a system of 3 diversion channels would carry water to smaller holding ponds carved into the hillside at staggered elevations, creating a cascade system that could be regulated by simple wooden gates. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it required moving approximately 400 tons of stone and excavating 60,000 cubic feet of earth. With 2 people and 2 horses, they developed a rhythm born of necessity and mutual respect. Elijah, stronger in the shoulders and back, would work the heavy pry bar, leveraging boulders from the creek bed while Adelaide used a smaller bar to position stones for rolling. Together, they would harness both horses to a stone boat, a flat sledge Elijah had constructed from pine logs, and drag the rocks to the dam site. Adelaide, who had a mason's eye for how stones fit together, would direct placement while Elijah mixed and applied the mortar, a lime-based cement they made themselves from materials hauled in from town. They worked from first light until dark, 6 days a week, resting only on Sundays and then only partially, using the day to repair equipment, tend the horses, and plan the next week's labor. Their hands became landscapes of calluses and split skin. Adelaide's back developed a permanent ache that she never mentioned. Elijah's shoulders broadened until his shirts no longer fit. They grew lean and hard and utterly focused. The town watched with a mixture of pity and amusement. Kern, at the Mercantile, started referring to their property as the Moss Folly, and the name stuck. When they came to town for supplies, which they did as infrequently as possible, they were met with knowing looks and barely suppressed smiles. "How's the creek building business?" someone would call out, and there would be laughter. Once, in the late fall of 1880, a group of men from town rode out to watch them work. They sat their horses on the ridge above the dam site, passing a bottle, making comments loud enough to carry. "Look at them," one said. "2 people trying to do what a crew of 20 couldn't do in a year." Another voice, slurred with whiskey. "Bet they quit before snow. Bet they're gone by spring." Adelaide, who was waist-deep in the reservoir excavation, shoveling mud into a wheelbarrow, paused just long enough to wipe her face. Then she went back to work. Elijah, setting stones in the dam face, didn't even look up. That night, in the small cabin they had built at the lower end of their property, Adelaide sat at their rough-hewn table and updated her engineering journal by lamplight. She recorded the day's progress, the measurements, the small victories and setbacks. Elijah, mending a harness strap, watched her write. "You ever wonder," he said quietly, "if they're right?" She looked up, her face shadowed and tired. "About what?" "About this being foolish." She set down her pen. "Every day. But then I think about what foolish actually means." She gestured at the journal, at the careful calculations and sketches. "This isn't foolish. It's hard. Those are different things." Elijah nodded. "They don't see the difference." "They will," she said, and returned to her writing. The first check dam was completed in the spring of 1881, 2 full years after they had started. It was a structure 40 feet wide, 8 feet high at the center, curved slightly upstream in a graceful arc that Adelaide had calculated would distribute hydraulic pressure evenly across the face. The reservoir behind it, carved into the hillside and lined with clay, they had dug from a deposit 2 miles distant, had a capacity of just over 200,000 gallons, exactly as designed. The diversion channels, 3 of them branching from the main reservoir, ran along the contour of the hillside like veins, each one feeding into a smaller holding pond. The entire system was controlled by a series of wooden gates that could be opened or closed to regulate flow. It was a feat of engineering that would have been impressive for a crew of experienced men with proper equipment. For 2 people working alone with hand tools and draft horses, it was extraordinary. It was also, as far as the town was concerned, a pointless monument to stubbornness, because the creek still ran dry in August. The problem, as Adelaide had known from the beginning, was capacity. 1 dam, 1 reservoir, was not enough. The spring runoff was too large, and the summer demand too great. They had built the proof of concept, but the concept required scale to function. They needed more dams, more reservoirs, more storage. They needed 3 more years of the same brutal labor they had just completed. Martin Schaefer rode out to inspect the dam in late May of 1881. He examined it with a critical eye, walking the length of the structure, studying the stonework, the gate system, the diversion channels. He was, despite himself, impressed. "This is fine work," he admitted. "Real fine. But it doesn't change anything. Come August, you'll still be dry." Elijah, who was repairing a gate hinge, nodded. "This year, yes." Schaefer frowned. "You planning to build more of these?" Adelaide, who was checking the water level in the main reservoir, answered without looking at him. 4 more. 5 total." Schaefer stared at her, then at Elijah, then back at the dam. "That'll take you, what, another 5 years? 6? Elijah looked at Adelaide. They had done the calculations many times. 3 years, he said, if we're lucky. Schaefer shook his head slowly, and for the first time, his expression was not mocking, but something closer to concern. "You'll kill yourselves. This kind of work, it breaks people." Adelaide finally turned to face him. "Then it breaks us. But the work gets done." Schaefer rode away without another word. That night, at the saloon, he told the assembled men that the Moss couple were not fools. They were something worse. They were fanatics. And there was no reasoning with fanatics. The second dam went faster, and the third faster still. Not because the work became easier, but because they became better at it. They learned which stones would split cleanly and which would shatter. They learned to read the soil, to identify clay deposits and gravel seams by the vegetation that grew above them. They learned to move a 200-pound boulder with leverage and patience instead of brute force. They learned to work in a silence that was not empty but full, a communication of glances and gestures that was more efficient than words. Adelaide's engineering became more sophisticated. The fourth dam incorporated a spillway design that automatically diverted excess water during heavy runoff, preventing overflow damage. The fifth dam, the lowest in the system, included a settling basin that would allow silt to drop out before the water entered the final irrigation channels. Each structure was an improvement on the last, a refinement of technique and understanding. By the spring of 1883, the system was complete. 5 check dams, 5 reservoirs, a total storage capacity of just over 1 million gallons, and a network of channels and gates that could deliver water to every acre of their property throughout the summer. It had taken 4 years, not 3. They had lost 1 horse to colic, and nearly lost Elijah to a boulder that slipped its chains and crushed his foot, an injury that left him with a permanent limp. Adelaide's hands were so scarred from rock work that she could no longer fully straighten her fingers. The cost in money, materials, and physical toll was incalculable, and no one cared, because it still hadn't rained. The summer of 1883 was the driest anyone could remember. By July, the creek that ran through Bridger's Hollow was a series of disconnected pools. By August, it was dust. The grass turned brown, then gray, then simply blew away. Cattle, desperate for water, broke through fences and died in the empty creek beds. Martin Schaefer lost 300 head. Smaller ranchers lost everything. The town well, which had never failed, dropped to a trickle. Water was rationed. Tempers frayed. And in the narrow valley that everyone called the Moss Folly, the grass grew green and thick. The system worked exactly as Adelaide had designed it. The spring runoff, captured and stored in the 5 reservoirs, was released throughout the summer in carefully measured amounts. The creek, which should have been as dry as every other waterway in the territory, ran clear and steady. Their 40 acres which should have been as brown and dead as the surrounding country, was a startling green oasis. They cut hay in July, a thick, healthy crop that yielded twice what anyone else in the valley had managed in the best of years. They cut again in late August. Their small herd of cattle, 20 head, grew fat while their neighbors' herds starved. It was impossible to ignore, and yet for weeks the town tried. Then the well went dry. It happened on a Thursday in early September. Josiah Kern was the first to discover it when he lowered his bucket and it came up with nothing but a handful of mud. Within an hour, every well in town had been checked. They were all the same. Dry, or nearly so. The nearest reliable water was the river, 8 miles distant over rough country. Hauling water for a town of 200 people was possible, but it would consume every wagon and every able-bodied man, and it would not be enough. That evening, a town meeting was called in the church. The mood was grim. Martin Schaefer stood at the front, his face haggard. "We need to talk about options," he said. "We can haul from the river, but that's a temporary solution. If this drought holds, we'll have to consider evacuation." The word hung in the air like a curse. Evacuation meant abandoning homes, businesses, the work of years. It meant admitting defeat. Josiah Kern, sitting in the front pew, cleared his throat. "There's water at the Moss place." The silence that followed was profound. Schaefer's jaw tightened. "I know." Someone in the back, a farmer named William Tate, spoke up. "Their creek is running. I seen it myself, full and clear." Another voice, bitter with resentment. "While ours are dust." Schaefer held up a hand. "The question is whether they'd be willing to share it, and whether we're willing to ask." The debate that followed was painful. Pride warred with necessity. They had mocked the Moss couple for 4 years. They had called their work foolish, wasteful, insane, and now they needed what that foolish work had created. Finally, Reverend John Halloway, an old man who rarely spoke but was respected when he did, stood. "Pride," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "is a luxury. We don't have luxuries anymore. We have a choice. We ask, or we leave." The vote was unanimous. The delegation arrived at the Moss property the next morning. It was led by Martin Schaefer and included Josiah Kern, Reverend Halloway, and Mayor Samuel Pritchard, a thin, nervous man who had been elected primarily because no one else wanted the job. They rode up the valley in silence, each man wrestling with his own discomfort. When they reached the cabin, they found Elijah and Adelaide working in the lower field, repairing a fence. The couple stopped and waited, their expressions neutral. Schaefer dismounted and walked forward. He removed his hat. "Mr. Moss, Mrs. Moss," he began, and then stopped, unsure how to continue. Adelaide saved him the trouble. "You need water." It was not a question. Schaefer nodded. "The town well is dry. Everything's dry. Your creek is the only water for 20 miles. Elijah glanced at Adelaide. She gave the smallest of nods. "How much do you need?" Elijah asked. Schaefer blinked. He had prepared arguments, justifications, even a plea. He had not expected simple pragmatism, enough for 200 people. Drinking, cooking, essential needs. "We can haul it. We just need access." Adelaide was already calculating. 20 gallons per person per day, minimum. That's 4,000 gallons daily. Our system can support that if we reduce irrigation and manage release carefully. She looked at Elijah. "We'll need to install a loading station at the lower gate." He nodded. "I can have that done by tomorrow." Schaefer stared at them. "You'll let us take it? Just like that?" Elijah met his eyes. "It's water, Mr. Schaefer. People need it. That's not complicated." Kern, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice rough. We weren't kind to you. Either of you. We said things. Adelaide's expression didn't change. You did. Kern looked at the ground. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Adelaide considered him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Apology accepted. But understand something, Mr. Kern. We didn't build this system to prove you wrong. We built it because it needed building. Whether you believe in it or not doesn't change whether it works. Reverend Halloway, who had been watching the exchange with keen interest, spoke for the first time. You're better people than we deserve. Adelaide shook her head. We're just people, Reverend. Same as you. We just had a different idea about what was possible. The loading station was completed by the following afternoon. It was a simple structure, a wooden platform built at the lower gate where wagons could pull up and fill barrels directly from the flow. Elijah installed a valve system that allowed precise control of the volume, ensuring that the town's needs were met without depleting the reservoirs beyond their capacity to regenerate. For the next 6 weeks, until the first snows came and the drought finally broke, a steady procession of wagons made the journey to the Moss property. 20 trips a day, sometimes more. Each time, either Elijah or Adelaide was there to help, to adjust the valve, to answer questions about the system. They never asked for payment. They never mentioned the years of mockery. They simply provided the water. The townspeople, for their part, were transformed by the experience. Shame was a powerful teacher. Men who had laughed at the Moss folly now studied the dams with reverence, asking technical questions, taking notes. Women who had pitied Adelaide's choice to do manual labor now spoke of her with respect that bordered on awe. Children were brought to see the system, and parents explained, with a humility that had not existed before, that this was what intelligence and hard work could accomplish. In late October, after the first significant rain had fallen and the crisis had passed, the town held a gathering at the church. It was billed as a harvest celebration, but everyone knew its real purpose. Martin Schaefer stood before the assembled crowd and gestured for Elijah and Adelaide to come forward. They did so reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention. Schaefer's voice was steady, but edged with emotion. 4 years ago, he said, these two people told us they were going to do something we thought was impossible. We laughed at them. We called them fools. We were wrong. He turned to face them directly. You saved this town, not just from thirst, but from our own arrogance. You showed us that the land doesn't have to be accepted as it is. It can be made better, and you did it with nothing but your own hands and your own minds. He held out a rolled document. The town council has voted unanimously to grant you water rights in perpetuity for the entire creek system on your property. No one can contest it. No one can take it. It's yours, legally and permanently. Elijah took the document, but Adelaide was the one who spoke. We appreciate this, she said, but we didn't do it for rights or recognition. We did it because it was the right thing to do. Schaefer nodded. I know. That's why you deserve it. The gathering ended with food and music, a rare moment of communal joy in a year that had been defined by hardship. But the most significant moment came later, after most people had left. Josiah Kern approached Adelaide, who was helping to clean up. He stood awkwardly, his hat in his hands. Mrs. Moss, he said, I've been thinking about what you built. She waited. I'd like to learn, he said, how to do what you did. I've got a piece of land up north, and it's got the same problem you had. Seasonal water, dry summers. I thought, maybe, if you'd be willing to teach me. Adelaide studied him, this man who had been among the most vocal of her critics. Then she smiled, a rare expression that softened her weathered face. "Come by next week," she said. "Bring paper and a pencil. We'll start with gradient calculations." Over the following years, the Moss system became a model. Kern built a smaller version on his property, and it worked. Others followed. By 1890, there were 14 water management systems in the territory based on Adelaide's designs, and the Bridgers Hollow region, once considered marginal, became known for its reliable water and productive land. Engineers from the territorial government came to study the systems, and Adelaide's techniques were written up in agricultural journals. She and Elijah were invited to speak at conferences, though they rarely accepted, preferring to stay on their land and continue refining their work. They lived simply and quietly, their partnership as strong in their later years as it had been in the beginning. They never had children, but they taught dozens of people, passing on not just the technical knowledge, but the philosophy behind it. The land can be made better. Hard work and intelligence can overcome limitation, and kindness, in the end, matters more than being right. Elijah died in 1904, his heart giving out while he was repairing a gate on the upper dam. Adelaide found him there, his tools still in his hands. She buried him on the ridge above the reservoir, where he could look down on the system they had built together. She lived another 12 years, maintaining the system alone, still teaching anyone who asked. When she died in 1916, the town of Bridgers Hollow closed for her funeral. She was buried beside Elijah, and the headstone, paid for by community subscription, bore a simple inscription: Adelaide Moss, engineer and teacher. She believed the land could be made better, and she proved it. The Moss system still functions today, more than a century after its construction. The dams have been reinforced with concrete, and modern valves have replaced the wooden gates, but the fundamental design remains unchanged. It is a testament to the precision of Adelaide's engineering and the quality of their work. The property is now a historical site, and engineering students still visit to study the elegant simplicity of the design. At the site of the first dam, there is a plaque installed by the Montana Historical Society. It reads, "In 1879, Elijah and Adelaide Moss began construction of a water management system that was considered impossible by their contemporaries. Through 4 years of labor, they proved that intelligence, partnership, and perseverance could transform marginal land into productive abundance. When drought threatened their community, they shared their water freely, asking nothing in return. This system stands as a monument to frontier ingenuity and the belief that we are not bound by the limitations we inherit, but empowered by the solutions we create." The creek still runs clear through Bridgers Hollow, even in the driest summers, a ribbon of green in a landscape that can be harsh and unforgiving. And those who know the history understand that this water, this life, exists because two people refused to accept that things had to be the way they had always been. They saw a problem, they engineered a solution, and they did it with a grace and generosity that transformed not just the land, but the people who lived on it